A little girl warns Millionaire. She paid the nurse to lie. He rushes to the hospital. Before we dive in, comment below if you believe softness can move mountains. Enjoy the story. Pierce Memorial Hospital hummed with evening quiet. Monitors beeped softly, nurses moved efficiently, and families whispered around bedsides. But in room 314, 6-year-old Isla Pierce sat unusually still, her brown eyes sharp and alert despite her hospital gown. Daniel Pierce, CEO of the hospital chain, leaned over his daughter's bed. At 40, responsibility lined his face. 3 months had passed since he'd lost his wife to medical complications, and now his daughter seemed to follow a similar path of mysterious symptoms and concerning test results. "Daddy," Isla whispered, her small hand reaching for his sleeve. Her voice carried an urgency that made him pause mid-gesture as he reached for her chart. "What is it, sweetheart?" Daniel's voice was gentle, but his mind was already racing through the day's medical consultations, the concerning lab results that Linda had shown him just hours before. Isla glanced toward the doorway, then pulled him closer. "I need to tell you something important. I'm not really sick." Daniel's brow furrowed. "What do you mean? Your tests show you have a fever, and the nurses—" "No, Daddy. Listen." Isla's grip tightened. "I heard Linda talking to the night nurse, Mrs. Peterson. Linda gave her money, then Mrs. Peterson wrote down that I had a fever when I didn't. I saw everything." The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. Linda, his girlfriend of 3 months, so supportive during this difficult time, coordinating Isla's care with dedication, the former communications manager who understood the hospital system better than anyone. "Isla, that's a very serious thing to say." Daniel kept his voice calm, but something cold was forming in his chest. "Are you absolutely certain about what you saw?" "Yes." Isla's eyes never wavered. "Linda said they needed to make me look sicker so you would sign papers. She said it was for your own good, but Daddy, I don't feel sick at all. Look." Isla sat up straight, her movements fluid and energetic. Nothing like the listless, feverish child the reports described. Her cheeks were pink with health, eyes bright and focused. Daniel stared at his daughter, struggling to process her words. In 3 months since Sarah's death, Linda had been his anchor. She'd helped him navigate grief, supported him through challenging decisions about Isla's care, even taken leave from her job to be available. But looking at Isla, really looking, he saw no sign of illness documented in her file. No fever flush, no lethargy, no digestive issues supposedly worsening over the past week. "Daddy, you believe me, don't you?" Isla's voice was small now, uncertain. "I know it sounds crazy, but I'm telling the truth. I drew a picture of what I saw. It's in my book." Daniel's world tilted. Everything he thought he knew, everything he had trusted, suddenly felt like shifting sand beneath his feet. Have you ever had a moment when a child tried to tell you something important, but you almost didn't listen? Sometimes the smallest voices carry the biggest truths. Let's see what Daniel discovers next. Daniel spent that evening in controlled turmoil. After Isla fell asleep, he made his way to the nurse's station, moving through familiar halls like a stranger. "Nurse Mary," he called softly to the veteran nurse who'd cared for Isla since admission. Mary Gonzalez, 50 years old with kind eyes, had worked at Pierce Memorial for over 2 decades. Isla adored her, often asking when Grandma Mary would return. But Mary wasn't at her usual station. "Excuse me," Daniel approached the head nurse on duty. "Where's Mary Gonzalez tonight? She's usually on this floor." The nurse, someone Daniel didn't recognize, barely looked up from her paperwork. "Oh, she was transferred to the cardiac wing. There was some issue with her performance here. Nothing serious, just administrative stuff." "Administrative stuff?" Daniel's voice carried the authority of ownership now. "What kind of administrative stuff?" The nurse suddenly looked uncomfortable, realizing who she was speaking to. I'm not really sure about the details, Mr. Pierce. You'd have to ask someone in management." Daniel made a mental note to follow up on that in the morning. Instead, he turned his attention to Isla's medical chart. As CEO, he had access to all patient records, But he rarely looked at individual cases unless they involved serious complications or legal issues. Isla's file painted a picture of mysterious symptoms: recurring fevers, digestive issues, fatigue, and behavioral changes consistent with illness-related stress. The entries were thorough, professional, and deeply concerning, but they didn't match the bright, alert child he'd just spoken with. Daniel pulled up electronic monitoring data from Isla's room. Temperature readings showed consistent low-grade fever. But he remembered touching Isla's forehead tonight. It had been cool, normal. He scrolled through nursing notes looking for Mary's entries. Her last note was 3 days ago. Patient alert and responsive, temperature normal, appetite good, no distress, query necessity of intensive monitoring. After that, all entries were from Mrs. Peterson and day shift nurses Daniel didn't know. Well, Mrs. Peterson's notes painted a different picture. Patient restless and feverish, refusing food. Requires constant monitoring. Recommend escalation of care protocols. The contradiction was stark. Daniel found himself walking to the security office. As hospital CEO, he had access to surveillance footage, though he rarely used it except for serious incidents. Tonight felt like a serious incident. "I need to review the footage from the pediatric wing," he told the night security guard. "Specifically around room 314 for the past week." The guard, a longtime employee named James, looked surprised but compliant. "Of course, Mr. Pierce, any particular time frame?" "Night shifts, between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. As the footage loaded, Daniel's hands clenched. He was either about to confirm his daughter's devastating accusation or discover that grief and stress had caused a 6-year-old to create an elaborate fantasy. The first night's footage showed routine activity. But on the third night, Daniel saw something that made his blood run cold. Linda entering Isla's room at 11:47 p.m. She wasn't scheduled to be there. He could see Linda speaking with Mrs. Peterson afterward. The interaction was brief, but Mrs. Peterson's body language suggested receiving instructions rather than casual conversation. At 12:15 a.m., Mrs. Peterson entered Isla's room with a thermometer and chart. She stayed less than 2 minutes. At 12:35 a.m., the nurse was at the computer terminal, typing for nearly 10 minutes. Daniel's mouth went dry. The timestamp on Isla's fever reading was 12:37 a.m., but in the footage, Isla appeared to sleep peacefully throughout. No tossing, no signs of fever or distress. "Sir?" James noticed Daniel's expression. "Is everything all right?" Daniel straightened, his CEO instincts kicking in even as his world crumbled around the edges. "I need copies of this footage. The past week, all-night shifts. And I need it kept confidential until further notice." "Of course, sir." As Daniel walked back toward the elevator, his mind raced. If Isla was right, if Linda was manipulating his daughter's medical records, then why? What could she gain from making Isla appear sicker than she was? 3 months ago, he'd been a grieving widower trying to save his daughter. Now he suspected the very person he'd trusted to help might be orchestrating the entire crisis. The worst part was his 6-year-old daughter had figured it out before he did. The next morning, Daniel arrived at the hospital earlier than usual. He had barely slept, replaying the security footage in his mind and trying to make sense of what he had witnessed. But before confronting Linda or Mrs. Peterson, he needed to see Isla's drawing. Isla was awake when he entered her room, sitting up in bed with a coloring book open in her lap. She looked up at him with those bright brown eyes, and Daniel's heart clenched. If his 6-year-old daughter was right about this, then he had failed her in the most fundamental way possible. "Good morning, sweetheart," he said, settling into the chair beside her bed. "You mentioned a drawing yesterday. Can I see it?" Isla's face brightened, but there was relief there too, relief that he was taking her seriously. She reached for a notebook tucked under her pillow, flipping through pages of typical childhood drawings. Flowers, houses, stick figures of her family. Then she found the page she was looking for. "Here," she said, handing him the notebook. "I drew this 2 nights ago after I saw them." Daniel looked down at the drawing and his breath caught. It was remarkably detailed for a 6-year-old's work. Isla had drawn her hospital room from a bird's-eye view. complete with the bed, the medical equipment, and the small table where nurses kept their charts. In the drawing, there were two stick figures standing beside the bed. One was labeled Linda, in Isla's careful printing. The other was labeled Nurse. Between them, Isla had drawn what looked like an envelope or piece of paper changing hands, but it was the detail in the corner that made Daniel's hands shake. Isla had drawn herself in the bed, but with one eye open, watching, and she had added, a speech bubble coming from Linda's figure. Right fever. Isla. Daniel's voice was barely a whisper. You saw Linda give the nurse money? It wasn't like dollar bills, Isla explained with the precision of a child trying to be understood by adults. It was in an envelope, but it was thick. And Linda whispered something about how you needed to sign papers and how this would help. You make the right decision. Daniel closed his eyes. There was only one set of papers he could think of that Linda had been encouraging him to sign. The financial power of attorney that would give her authority to make medical decisions for Isla if Daniel was incapacitated or unavailable. Linda had been gently pushing the idea for weeks, framing it as a practical safety measure. What if something happens to you? She had said. What if you're in an accident or have a medical emergency of your own? Isla needs someone who understands the system, someone who can make decisions quickly. It had made sense at the time. Linda's background in hospital administration meant she understood the complexities of medical care better than his parents or siblings, and after losing Sarah, the thought of leaving Isla without proper advocacy had terrified him. But now, looking at his daughter's drawing, those conversations took on a sinister new meaning. Daddy, there's more, Isla said quietly. Yesterday morning, Linda came to visit me when you weren't here. She asked me lots of questions about how I was feeling, and when I said I felt fine, she got upset. She told me I shouldn't worry you by pretending to be better than I really was. She said that? Yes. And she said that sometimes children don't realize how sick they are, and that the grown-ups needed to make sure I got the right care. She said you were under a lot of stress, and that she was trying to help you make good decisions. Daniel felt something dark and cold settling in his chest. Linda had been coaching Isla to downplay her own health, to mistrust her own feelings about her body. But I know how I feel, Isla continued with the stubborn certainty of childhood. I feel fine. I feel normal. My tummy doesn't hurt, and I don't have a fever, and I'm not tired all the time like the nurses keep writing down. As if summoned by their conversation, Linda appeared in the doorway. She looked impeccable as always, professionally dressed, makeup perfect, carrying a small bouquet of flowers and wearing the warm smile that had comforted Daniel through so many difficult days. Good morning, you two, she said, her voice bright and cheerful. How's our patient today? Daniel watched his daughter's reaction. Isla's entire demeanor changed. The bright, animated child who had been showing him her drawing suddenly became subdued, almost withdrawn. I'm okay, Isla said quietly, closing the notebook and sliding it back under her pillow. Just okay? Linda approached the bed with practiced concern. The night nurse said you had quite a difficult night. Your fever spiked around midnight. Daniel's jaw tightened. He had seen the footage. There had been no fever spike, no difficult night. Actually, he said carefully, Isla seems much better this morning. Perhaps we should have Dr. Chen reevaluate her current treatment plan. Linda's smile flickered for just a moment, so briefly that Daniel might have missed it if he hadn't been watching for exactly that reaction. Of course, she said smoothly. Though I should mention, Dr. Chen is concerned about some inconsistencies in Isla's responses to treatment. He's been discussing the possibility of transferring her to the specialized pediatric facility in Portland, the one that deals with complex cases that need more intensive monitoring. Daniel felt the trap closing around him. A transfer to Portland would remove Isla from Pierce Memorial entirely, placing her in a facility where Daniel would have less access and oversight, where Linda's connections and influence could more easily control the narrative of Isla's care. I haven't heard anything about a transfer, Daniel said. It's still being discussed, Linda replied. Dr. Chen wanted to present all the options to you once he had completed his evaluation, but given how challenging this case has been and how much it's affecting you personally, he thought it might be best to get Isla the specialized care she needs. Daniel looked at his daughter, who was watching the exchange with the careful attention of a child who understood more than the adults realized. I think, Daniel said slowly, that any major decisions about Isla's care should wait until we have a clearer picture of her current condition. I'd like to request a full re-evaluation of her case, starting with a complete review of all medical records and nursing notes. For the first time since he'd known her, Linda looked genuinely uncomfortable. Of course, she said, whatever you think is best. But as she turned to leave, Daniel caught something in her expression. A flash of calculation, of someone whose carefully laid plans had just hit an unexpected obstacle. After Linda left, Isla looked up at her father with something like hope in her eyes. Daddy, do you believe me now? Daniel reached over and took his daughter's small hand in his larger one. Yes, sweetheart. I believe you. And I'm going to fix this. The confrontation Daniel had been dreading came sooner than expected. That afternoon, Linda arrived at his office with Dr. Chen and a folder full of documents that seemed to have materialized overnight. Daniel, we need to talk, Linda said, her voice carrying a gravity that immediately put him on edge. Dr. Chen, the hospital's chief pediatrician, looked uncomfortable, a man caught between his medical obligations and administrative pressures he didn't fully understand. Isla's condition has deteriorated more rapidly than we anticipated, Dr. Chen began, consulting his notes with the nervous precision of someone who had been coached on what to say. The latest blood work shows some concerning markers that suggest we're dealing with something more complex than initially diagnosed. Daniel's medical background was limited to hospital administration, but he knew enough to ask the right questions. What kind of markers and when was this blood drawn? This morning while you were in your board meeting, Linda answered before Dr. Chen could respond. I coordinated with the lab to expedite the results because I was concerned about some symptoms I observed yesterday evening. You observed symptoms? Daniel's voice was carefully controlled. What symptoms? Disorientation? Difficulty sleeping? Complaints of nausea that she seemed to be hiding from you? Linda rattled off with the fluency of someone who had prepared this list. Children often try to protect their parents by downplaying their symptoms, especially when they sense that their illness is causing stress. Daniel thought about his conversation with Isla that morning, how alert and coherent she had been, how she had drawn that detailed picture and explained the situation with clarity beyond her years. I'd like to see those blood results, he said. Dr. Chen hesitated, glancing at Linda before handing over the lab report. The numbers looked concerning to Daniel's untrained eye, but something nagged at him about the timeline. This shows a blood draw at 9:30 a.m., Daniel noted, but I was with Isla at 9:15 and she seemed completely normal. Alert, responsive, no signs of nausea or disorientation. Sometimes children can mask symptoms for short periods, Linda said gently, especially when they want to please their parents. The important thing is that we address this before it becomes critical. Dr. Chen opened the folder he had brought, revealing a stack of forms and authorizations. Given the complexity of the case and the specialized nature of the treatment Isla may need, we're recommending immediate transfer to Portland Children's Hospital. They have resources we simply don't have here. Additionally, Linda added, her voice taking on a tone of practiced concern, we think it would be wise for you to sign a temporary medical power of attorney, just as a precaution. If Isla's condition worsens rapidly or if you're not immediately available, someone needs to have the authority to make quick decisions. Daniel stared at the papers in front of him. The transfer authorization would remove Isla from his hospital entirely. The power of attorney would give Linda complete control over his daughter's medical care. I need time to think about this, Daniel said. Daniel? Linda's voice carried a note of urgency now. I understand this is frightening, but we can't afford to delay. Isla's condition is unstable, and every hour we wait increases the risk of serious complications. What exactly are you suggesting could happen? Daniel asked. Dr. Chen cleared his throat uncomfortably. The blood markers suggest possible liver complications. If we're right and if the condition progresses, Isla could need immediate intervention, possibly surgical. Daniel felt the walls closing in around him. Everything they were telling him was medically plausible, professionally presented, and terrifying. If he was wrong about his suspicions, if he delayed treatment because of paranoid fantasies, he could lose his daughter the same way he had lost his wife. But if he was right, "I want to see Isla first," Daniel said. "I want to talk to her, assess her condition myself." "Of course," Linda said quickly. "But Daniel, please don't let your personal feelings cloud your medical judgment. I know how hard this is for you, especially after Sarah." The mention of his wife hit Daniel like a physical blow. Linda knew exactly how to use his grief, his fear, his love for his daughter against him. They made their way to Isla's room together. Daniel's heart was pounding as they entered, not knowing what they would find. Isla was sitting up in bed, working on a puzzle that one of the nurses had brought her. She looked up when they entered, and Daniel searched her face for any sign of the deteriorating condition that Dr. Chen had described. What he saw was a healthy 6-year-old who looked tired of being in a hospital bed. "Hi, Daddy," she said brightly. "Look, I almost finished the whole puzzle. It's a picture of a garden with butterflies." "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Daniel asked, ignoring the way Linda tensed beside him. "I feel good," Isla said. "My tummy doesn't hurt and I'm not hot anymore. Can we go home soon?" Daniel looked at Dr. Chen, whose expression was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. "This doesn't look like a child with liver complications," Daniel said quietly. "Children can appear deceptively well even with serious internal issues," Linda said smoothly. "That's precisely why we need the specialized monitoring that Portland can provide." But Daniel was no longer looking at Linda. He was watching his daughter, who had suddenly gone very still. Isla's eyes darted between the adults, and Daniel saw recognition there. And fear. "Isla," he said gently, "Dr. Chen thinks you might need to go to a different hospital. How do you feel about that?" The change in Isla's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. The bright, alert child vanished, replaced by someone who looked genuinely distressed. "I don't want to go to a different hospital," she said, her voice small and scared. "I want to stay here with Nurse Mary. I want to go home." "Sweetheart, Nurse Mary isn't working on this floor anymore," Linda said with false gentleness. "And this new hospital has doctors who specialize in helping children who have the same kind of illness you do." Isla's eyes filled with tears, and she looked directly at her father. "Daddy, I told you the truth. Why won't you believe me?" The room fell silent. Dr. Chen looked confused, but Linda's expression was carefully neutral. Too neutral. "What truth, Isla?" Daniel asked, his voice gentle but clear. Isla glanced at Linda, then back at her father. "I told you I'm not really sick. I told you what I saw. But you're going to send me away anyway." "Isla, honey," Linda started to say, but Daniel held up a hand to stop her. "Let her talk," he said. "I heard Linda on the phone yesterday," Isla continued, her words tumbling out in a rush. "She was talking to someone about money, and about how once you signed the papers, everything would be easier. She said the new hospital would be better because they wouldn't ask so many questions." Daniel felt something cold and final settle in his chest. He looked at Linda, whose face had gone pale. "Is that true?" he asked quietly. "Daniel, she's 6 years old," Linda said, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. "She's confused, probably, experiencing some cognitive effects from her illness. You can't base medical decisions on the fantasies of a sick child." But Daniel was done listening. He moved to Isla's bedside and took her hand. "I believe you," he said simply. "And you're not going to any other hospital?" He turned to Dr. Chen. "I'm declining the transfer. I want a complete review of all lab work, all nursing notes, and all medication administration. And I want it done by medical staff who haven't been involved in Isla's case up to this point." Dr. Chen nodded, looking relieved to be stepping back from whatever he had unknowingly been pulled into. Linda's composure finally cracked. "Daniel, you're making a mistake. You're letting grief and paranoia cloud your judgment. Isla needs specialized care, and you're denying her that because you can't accept that she's seriously ill. Daniel looked at his girlfriend of 3 months, the woman he had trusted with his daughter's life, and saw a stranger. "I think," he said quietly, "that you should leave. Now." Linda's eyes flashed with something dangerous. Anger, frustration, and something else that Daniel couldn't quite identify. "You'll regret this," she said. "When something happens to Isla because you were too stubborn to listen to medical professionals, you'll regret this decision for the rest of your life." After she left, Daniel sat beside Isla's bed in silence. His daughter reached over and took his hand. "I'm sorry, Daddy," she said quietly. "I'm sorry I had to tell you something so scary." Daniel squeezed her hand gently. "You have nothing to be sorry for, sweetheart. You were brave, and you told the truth. That's exactly what you should have done." But even as he comforted his daughter, Daniel's mind was racing. Linda's reaction had confirmed his worst fears, but it also raised new questions. If she had been manipulating Isla's medical records, what was her ultimate goal, and how far was she willing to go to achieve it? The answers, he was beginning to realize, might be more dangerous than he had imagined. Daniel has chosen to believe his daughter, but Linda isn't finished. What happens next will test everything Daniel thought he knew about trust, manipulation, and how far someone will go for money. That evening, as Daniel sat in his office reviewing Isla's medical files with fresh eyes, there was a soft knock on his door. He looked up to see an elderly man he recognized from the hospital corridors, but had never formally met. "Mr. Pierce? I'm Walter Holbrook. I'm a patient on the same floor as your daughter." Walter was a distinguished man in his late 60s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the careful posture of someone who had spent years sitting at a desk. Despite being in hospital pajamas and a robe, he carried himself with quiet dignity. "Of course, Mr. Holbrook, please come in. Is there something I can help you with?" Walter stepped into the office, carrying what appeared to be a small electronic device. "Actually, sir, I believe I might be able to help you. I've been following the situation with your daughter, and I think there are some things you need to see." Daniel gestured to a chair across from his desk. "What kind of things?" Walter settled himself carefully, then looked directly at Daniel with the serious expression of someone about to share information that would change everything. "Before I retired, I worked for 35 years as a surveillance technician for various security companies. Old habits die hard, Mr. Pierce. I tend to notice things that others might miss." He placed the small device on Daniel's desk. It was a compact digital camera, the kind used for discreet recording. "I've been having trouble sleeping since my surgery," Walter continued. "So I spend a lot of time awake at night, watching the hallway activity from my room. 3 weeks ago, I started noticing some unusual patterns in the night shift routines." Daniel leaned forward. "What kind of patterns?" "Your girlfriend Linda was visiting the hospital during night shifts, not occasionally, regularly, almost every night for the past 2 weeks, and she wasn't visiting patients." Walter's fingers worked carefully on the camera's small display screen. "I started recording some of these visits. At first I thought it might be innocent. Perhaps she was helping with administrative work or checking on your daughter as a concerned partner." The camera's screen lit up, showing a grainy but clear view of the hospital corridor outside Isla's room. "But then I captured this." Walter turned the camera toward Daniel and pressed play. The timestamp showed 11:43 p.m., 2 nights ago. The video showed Linda approaching Mrs. Peterson at the nurse's station. Linda was carrying a manila envelope, and her body language suggested urgency and secrecy, rather than casual conversation. Daniel watched as Linda handed the envelope to Mrs. Peterson. Even in the dim hallway lighting, he could see Mrs. Peterson's reluctance, her nervous glances around the corridor. The conversation was brief, but it ended with Mrs. Peterson nodding and tucking the envelope into her uniform pocket. "That's not all," Walter said quietly, advancing the video. The next segment showed Mrs. Peterson entering Isla's room at 12:15 a.m. She carried what appeared to be medical equipment, but her movements were quick and furtive rather than the careful, methodical approach of normal medical care. She was in the room for less than 3 minutes, Walter explained. But watch what happens next. At 12:18 a.m., Mrs. Peterson emerged from Isla's room and went directly to the computer terminal in the hallway. For the next 12 minutes, she typed steadily, occasionally referring to notes from her pocket. Daniel's hands clenched as he realized what he was watching. The fabrication of medical records in real time. "There's more," Walter said, his voice gentle but firm. "This has been happening for over a week." He showed Daniel several more video segments, each following the same pattern. Linda arriving during night shifts, meeting with Mrs. Peterson, money, or documents changing hands, followed by Mrs. Peterson entering Isla's room and then immediately updating electronic medical records. "Mr. Pierce," Walter said, "I spent 3 decades documenting evidence for insurance fraud cases and criminal investigations. What you're looking at is systematic medical fraud." Daniel sat back in his chair, his mind reeling. The evidence was undeniable, but the implications were staggering. "Why?" he asked, almost to himself. What could she possibly gain from this? Walter reached into his robe pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "I think this might answer that question. I overheard a phone conversation Linda had in the family lounge 2 nights ago. I wrote down what I could remember." Daniel unfolded the paper and read Walter's careful handwriting. "The numbers look good. Once he signs the power of attorney, we can initiate the transfer to Portland. The facility there has already agreed to the extended care protocol. Yes, the insurance will cover the full 6 months of intensive treatment. No, he won't question it once she's out of his hospital. He'll be too guilty about doubting the initial diagnosis. The total authorization should be around $800,000, maybe more if we extend the treatment timeline." Daniel's vision blurred as the full scope of Linda's plan became clear. She wasn't just manipulating Isla's medical records to gain control. She was planning to use that control to authorize hundreds of thousands of dollars in unnecessary medical treatment that would be billed to Isla's insurance, with Linda likely receiving kickbacks from the Portland facility. $800,000, Daniel whispered. "At minimum," Walter confirmed grimly. "Based on what I overheard, this was just the first phase. There was discussion of extending the treatment, possibly to a year or more, depending on how successfully she could maintain the fiction of Isla's illness." Daniel thought about all the conversations he'd had with Linda over the past few weeks, how she had gradually introduced the idea of transferring Isla to Portland, how she had emphasized the specialized nature of the treatment needed, how she had framed the power of attorney as a simple precaution. "She's been planning this for weeks," he realized. "Possibly longer," Walter agreed. "Mr. Pierce, I don't know your personal situation, but I feel obligated to tell you that Linda has been asking questions about your family's financial situation, your insurance coverage, and your daughter's trust fund." Daniel's blood ran cold. "Trust fund?" "She mentioned to Mrs. Peterson that your daughter has a substantial trust fund from her mother's estate, and that medical emergencies would provide legitimate access to those funds for treatment purposes." Sarah's life insurance policy had indeed established a trust fund for Isla, worth over $2 million, but it was specifically structured so that funds could only be accessed for legitimate medical care, education, or other approved expenses related to Isla's welfare. Linda had been planning to steal his daughter's inheritance by creating a fake medical emergency that would justify massive treatment expenses. Daniel stood up abruptly, his hands shaking with a mixture of rage and relief. Relief that they had discovered the plot before Linda could fully implement it. Rage at the thought of what she had been willing to do to a 6-year-old child for money. "Mr. Holbrook," he said, his voice tight with emotion, "I need to ask you to do something for me. Will you take this evidence to the police?" Walter nodded solemnly. "I already have copies prepared for law enforcement. But, sir, there's something else you need to know." Daniel looked up from the camera, dreading what new revelation might be coming. "Linda called Mrs. Peterson about an hour ago. From what I overheard, she's planning to move forward with the transfer tomorrow morning. She told Mrs. Peterson that you had agreed to sign the papers and that the Portland facility was expecting Isla by noon." Daniel's heart stopped. "Tomorrow morning?" Mrs. Peterson seemed surprised that the timeline had moved up so quickly, but Linda apparently convinced her that your daughter's condition had deteriorated and that emergency transfer was necessary. Daniel grabbed his phone and dialed the nurse's station. When someone answered, he spoke with the authority of a hospital CEO who had just discovered a plot against his child. "This is Daniel Pierce. I want a security guard posted outside room 314 immediately. No one, and I mean no one, is to enter that room or have any contact with the patient without my direct authorization. Anyone who attempts to access the patient or remove her from the hospital is to be detained immediately." He hung up and looked at Walter, who was watching him with quiet approval. "Thank you," Daniel said simply. "You may have saved my daughter's life." Walter stood up, carefully tucking the camera back into his robe pocket. "I had a granddaughter who was about your daughter's age when she passed away. Children should be protected, Mr. Pierce. They should never be used as pawns in adult schemes." As Walter left the office, Daniel realized that Linda had made one critical mistake in her elaborate plan. She had underestimated the power of people who genuinely cared about children, his daughter's intuitive understanding of deception, and an elderly man's sense of justice. Now he had the evidence he needed to stop her. But Linda didn't know that yet, and Daniel intended to use that advantage to ensure she never had the opportunity to hurt another child again. Daniel arrived at the hospital the next morning at 5:30 a.m., well before Linda's expected arrival. He had spent the sleepless night coordinating with hospital security, the police, and the state medical board. Today, Linda would finally reveal the full scope of her plan. But when Daniel reached Isla's floor, his blood ran cold. The security guard he had posted was nowhere to be seen, and the nurse's station was unusually quiet for the morning shift change. Daniel's pace quickened as he approached room 314. The room was empty. Isla's bed was unmade, her personal belongings were gone, and there was no sign of his daughter anywhere. "Excuse me," Daniel called to a nurse he didn't recognize. "Where is the patient from room 314? The nurse checked her computer with practiced efficiency. Isla Pierce was transferred to Portland Children's Hospital at 6 a.m. for emergency treatment. The transfer was authorized by her medical power of attorney holder." Daniel's world tilted. "What medical power of attorney?" The nurse looked confused. "The paperwork shows that you signed a temporary power of attorney yesterday evening, authorizing Linda Westfield to make medical decisions in case of emergency. Ms. Westfield determined that the patient's condition had deteriorated overnight and required immediate specialized care." "I never signed any power of attorney," Daniel said, his voice deadly quiet. The nurse's face went pale as she realized the implications of what she had just revealed. Daniel was already pulling out his phone, calling his head of security. "I need the location of Linda Westfield immediately, and I need state police notified that a child has been unlawfully removed from this hospital." But even as he made the call, Daniel's mind was racing ahead. Linda was smart, calculating. She wouldn't have taken Isla to Portland Children's Hospital. That would be too easy to track. She would have taken his daughter somewhere else, somewhere she could maintain control while she figured out her next move. His phone rang. It was James from hospital security. "Mr. Pierce, I have some information about the security guard who was supposed to be posted outside your daughter's room. He received a call at 4 a.m. saying that you had canceled the security detail and that he was needed in the emergency department instead." "Who made that call?" "Someone claiming to be you, sir." The guard said the voice was familiar enough that he didn't question it. Daniel closed his eyes. Linda had thought of everything, even down to removing the security obstacle that would have prevented her from accessing Isla. His phone rang again. This time it was an unknown number. "Hello, Daniel." Linda's voice was calm, almost cheerful, as if they were discussing weekend plans rather than the kidnapping of his daughter. "Where is Isla?" Daniel's voice was controlled, but there was no mistaking the threat underneath. "She's safe, Daniel. She's getting the medical care she needs, care that you were too stubborn and paranoid to authorize. Linda, whatever you think you're going to accomplish, it's over. I have evidence of everything you've done. The falsified medical records, the bribes to nursing staff, the fraudulent power of attorney. Bring Isla back now and maybe we can work something out. Linda's laugh was soft but chilling. Oh, Daniel, you're still thinking like this is about your hospital, your rules, your authority. But we're not at Pierce Memorial anymore, are we? Daniel felt ice forming in his veins. Where are you? Isla is at a private medical facility that specializes in complex pediatric cases. The kind of cases that require long-term care, sometimes months or even years of treatment. The kind of treatment that costs hundreds of thousands of dollars, all of which will be covered by Isla's trust fund and your insurance. You're talking about stealing a $2 million inheritance from a 6-year-old child. I'm talking about ensuring that Isla gets the medical care she needs regardless of her father's emotional limitations. You've proven that you can't make rational decisions about her treatment, Daniel. You're still too traumatized by your wife's death to think clearly about Isla's needs. Daniel realized that Linda was no longer just talking about money. There was something else driving her, something deeper and more dangerous than simple greed. This isn't about Isla's medical care, he said slowly. This is about Sarah, isn't it? The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds too long. Sarah died because you made poor medical decisions, Linda said finally, her voice no longer calm. You second-guessed the doctors, you delayed treatment, you let your emotions override medical expertise, and Sarah died because of your failures. Daniel's breath caught. This wasn't just about money. It was about Linda's twisted belief that she was saving Isla from her father's perceived incompetence. That's not what happened, Daniel said quietly. Sarah died because of complications that no one could have predicted or prevented. That's what you tell yourself. Linda's voice was growing more agitated. But I read the medical records, Daniel. I saw the timeline. There were opportunities to intervene earlier, chances to try different treatments. But you kept questioning. The doctors kept asking for second opinions, kept delaying decisions. And while you hesitated, Sarah got sicker. Daniel realized he was dealing with someone whose mental state was far more fragile than he had understood. Linda hadn't just been planning insurance fraud. She had been planning to save Isla from what she perceived as Daniel's dangerous incompetence as a parent. Linda, listen to me, Daniel said, trying to keep his voice calm and reasonable. I understand that you think you're protecting Isla, but she's not sick. You know she's not sick. You've been falsifying her medical records for weeks. She would have become sick, Linda said, with the frightening certainty of someone who had convinced herself of an alternate reality. Children in her situation always do. The stress, the trauma of losing her mother, the genetic predisposition. It was just a matter of time. I was preventing a crisis, not creating one. Daniel realized that reasoning with Linda was impossible. She had constructed an elaborate justification for her actions that made her the hero of the story, saving a child from an incompetent father who had already killed his wife through medical negligence. Where's the facility, Linda? Somewhere safe, somewhere you can't interfere with her treatment. Linda, I'm going to find her, and when I do, you're going to face charges for kidnapping, fraud, and child endangerment. End this now, and bring Isla home. You know what's interesting, Daniel? Linda's voice had taken on an eerie calm. Isla keeps insisting that she feels fine. Even now, even after everything that's happened, she keeps saying she wants to go home to her daddy. She doesn't understand that her daddy can't protect her the way her mommy needed to be protected. Daniel's heart clenched at the thought of his terrified daughter, confused and alone, being held by someone who genuinely believed she was saving her. Let me talk to her, he said. I don't think that's a good idea. She's scheduled for some important tests this morning, and I don't want her emotional state to affect the results. The line went dead. Daniel immediately called the police detective who had been assigned to the case. She's got Isla at some kind of private medical facility. She's planning to keep her there long-term, possibly indefinitely. We need to find them now. But even as he coordinated with law enforcement, Daniel's mind was working on a different level. Linda was smart, but she was also increasingly unstable. She had made several mistakes in her phone call, references that might help track her location, hints about the facility she had chosen. Most importantly, she had revealed that Isla was still fighting back. still insisting on the truth despite everything Linda had put her through. His 6-year-old daughter was still being brave, still being honest, still trusting that her father would find her. Daniel was not going to let her down. This is it. The moment everything comes together. Daniel is about to face the most terrifying race against time of his life. Will he find Isla before Linda's delusions lead to something unthinkable? The break in the case came from an unexpected source. Walter Holbrook called Daniel at 8:30 a.m. with information that changed everything. "Mr. Pierce, I remembered something about that phone conversation I overheard. Linda mentioned a Dr. Richardson at a facility called Riverside Wellness Center. I looked it up. It's a private medical facility about 40 minutes outside the city. They specialize in what they call comprehensive care for complex cases." Daniel's hands were shaking as he called the detective in charge of the case. Within minutes, they had confirmed that Riverside Wellness Center existed, and that Linda had indeed brought a 6-year-old patient there for emergency psychiatric evaluation and stabilization. The facility had been told that Isla was experiencing severe psychological trauma and delusions, and that she might claim her father was trying to rescue her as part of her psychiatric break from reality. Linda had been thorough in her preparation. Daniel arrived at Riverside Wellness Center with 2 police detectives and a social worker. The facility was exactly what Linda had promised: expensive, discreet, and specialized in cases where families needed difficult decisions made for them. Dr. Richardson met them in the lobby, a smooth, professional man who seemed genuinely surprised by the police presence. "I'm afraid there's been some misunderstanding," he said. "The child you're referring to was brought here by her legal guardian for emergency psychiatric evaluation. She's been exhibiting signs of severe trauma and dissociation." "I'm her father," Daniel said quietly, "and I never authorized any psychiatric evaluation." Dr. Richardson's expression shifted as he began to realize the situation he had unknowingly become involved in. "Sir, I have documentation showing that Linda Westfield has legal authority to make medical decisions for the child. She presented what appeared to be a valid power of attorney, signed by you." "The power of attorney is forged," Detective Martinez said, showing Dr. Richardson the evidence they had compiled. "Ms. Westfield has been systematically falsifying medical records and manipulating the child's care for financial gain." Dr. Richardson's face went pale. "Oh my God. She's with the child right now, conducting an interview session." Daniel felt his heart stop. "What kind of interview session?" Ms. Westfield insisted on being present during the psychological evaluation. She said the child had developed an unhealthy attachment to her father and might become agitated without a familiar presence. They found Linda in a small windowless room that was designed to be calming for psychiatric patients. Isla was sitting in a child-sized chair, looking small and frightened, while Linda sat across from her with a clipboard, asking questions in a gentle but persistent voice. "And when did you first start having thoughts about your father being in danger?" Linda was asking as they entered the room. Isla looked up and saw Daniel standing in the doorway. Her face lit up with relief and joy that broke Daniel's heart. "Daddy," she cried, jumping up from her chair and running toward him, but Linda intercepted her, placing a gentle but firm hand on Isla's shoulder. "Isla, sweetheart, remember what we talked about? Sometimes when children are very scared, they can see people who aren't really there. Your daddy isn't really here right now. This is part of the confusion we're trying to help you with." Daniel watched his daughter's face crumple with confusion and fear. Linda was trying to convince a 6-year-old that her own father was a hallucination. "I'm real, sweetheart," Daniel said, moving slowly into the room. "I'm here, and I'm going to take you home." Linda turned toward Daniel with an expression of calm certainty that was more frightening than any anger would have been. "Daniel, you can't be here. This is a secure facility, and Isla is in the middle of a critical psychological evaluation. Your presence will only worsen her dissociative episodes." "Ma'am," Detective Martinez said, stepping forward with handcuffs, "you're under arrest for kidnapping, fraud, and child endangerment." But Linda didn't seem to hear him. Her attention was focused entirely on Isla, who was looking back and forth between the adults with the careful attention of a child trying to understand a situation that made no sense. "Isla," Linda said gently, "I need you to understand something very important. Your daddy is sick just like your mommy was sick. And sometimes when grown-ups are sick, they make bad decisions that can hurt the people they love." "Linda, stop," Daniel said, but she continued as if he hadn't spoken. "The doctors here are going to help you understand why your daddy can't take care of you anymore. It's not his fault, and it's not your fault. But sometimes children need to be protected from parents who are too sick to make good choices." Isla looked directly at Linda with the clear-eyed assessment of a child who had been lied to many times. "You're the one who's sick," she said quietly. "You're the one who lies and hurts people and tries to make everyone believe things that aren't true." Linda's composure finally cracked. "Isla, you don't understand. I'm trying to save you. I'm trying to prevent what happened to your mother from happening to you. My mother died from cancer," Isla said with the matter-of-fact tone of a child who had been given an honest explanation of difficult circumstances. "She didn't die because Daddy made bad decisions. She died because sometimes people get sick, and the doctors can't fix them." Linda stared at the 6-year-old who had just articulated what Linda herself had been unable to accept. The random, unfair nature of illness and death. The fact that sometimes bad things happen despite everyone's best efforts. "But if he had acted faster," Linda whispered. "It wouldn't have mattered," Daniel said gently. "Sarah's cancer was aggressive and advanced by the time we discovered it. The timeline wouldn't have changed the outcome." For the first time since Daniel had known her, Linda looked truly fragile. The elaborate justifications she had constructed were crumbling, leaving her face to face with the grief and helplessness that had been driving her actions all along. "I couldn't save her," Linda said, her voice barely audible. "I worked in that hospital for 5 years and I couldn't save her." Daniel realized that Linda's breakdown wasn't just about money or control. It was about a woman who had watched someone she cared about die and had convinced herself that the right manipulation, the right control, could prevent it from happening again. But understanding Linda's motivations didn't change what she had done to his daughter. "Isla," Daniel said, kneeling down to his daughter's level. "Are you okay? Did anyone hurt you?" Isla shook her head, then threw her arms around his neck, with the fierce intensity of a child who had been brave for as long as she could manage. "I knew you would find me," she whispered. "I told them I wasn't sick and I told them you would come, but nobody believed me." "I believed you," Daniel said, holding her tight. "I should have believed you sooner, but I believed you when it mattered." The police led Linda away. She looked back at Daniel with an expression of profound sadness. "I really thought I was helping," she said. Daniel nodded. "I know, but helping means listening to the truth, even when it's not what we want to hear." 3 weeks later, Daniel and Isla stood in the small garden behind Pierce Memorial Hospital. It was a quiet space that most people overlooked, with stone benches and flower beds that were maintained by volunteers and staff members who understood the healing power of growing things. Sarah had loved this garden. During her treatment, she had spent hours here, reading to Isla and talking about the flowers they would plant together when she got better. Now, Daniel and Isla were finally planting those flowers. "The daffodils go here," Isla said with the authority of someone who had been planting this garden for months. "Mommy said daffodils are brave because they come up even when it's still cold outside." Daniel smiled, helping his daughter dig small holes in the soft earth. "Your mommy was right about a lot of things." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, their hands dirty with soil and their faces warm in the afternoon sun. Isla seemed different since their ordeal, more confident, more sure of herself. She had been through something that would have traumatized many adults, but she had emerged with her innate sense of truth and justice intact. "Daddy," Isla said as she carefully placed a daffodil bulb in its hole, "why did Linda think lying would help people?" Daniel considered the question seriously. Isla deserved honest answers, even to difficult questions. "I think Linda was very sad about Mommy dying," he said. "And sometimes when people are that sad, They start to believe that if they can just control everything perfectly, they can prevent bad things from happening. But that's not how it works, Isla said with the clarity of childhood. No, sweetheart, that's not how it works. Bad things sometimes happen even when everyone does everything right. And lying about it doesn't make it better. It just makes everything more confusing. They continued planting bulbs, creating the memorial garden that Sarah had dreamed of. As they worked, Daniel reflected on everything that had changed in the past month. Linda was facing multiple felony charges, but she was also receiving the psychiatric help she needed to address the grief and trauma that had driven her actions. Mrs. Peterson, the night nurse who had been bribed into falsifying records, had lost her nursing license but was cooperating with authorities to ensure that no other children had been harmed by similar schemes. Dr. Chen had requested a transfer to another department. Ashamed of his unwitting participation in Linda's plan, Daniel had accepted his resignation graciously, understanding that the manipulation had been sophisticated enough to fool experienced medical professionals. Most importantly, Nurse Mary had been reinstated to the pediatric floor, where she belonged. Mr. Pierce? Daniel looked up to see Walter Holbrook approaching, walking slowly but steadily. The elderly man had become a frequent visitor to the hospital, not as a patient but as a volunteer who helped with the children's activities. Walter. Daniel stood and shook the older man's hand. How are you feeling? Much better, thank you. The surgery was successful and I'm looking forward to going home next week. Walter smiled down at Isla, who was carefully arranging stones around the newly planted bulbs. I wanted to thank you both. Thank us? Daniel was surprised. This whole experience reminded me that there's still important work to be done. I've decided to volunteer with the Children's Advocacy Program here at the hospital. My background in surveillance and investigation might be useful in ensuring that children's voices are heard and protected. Isla looked up from her gardening. That's good. Children tell the truth a lot, but sometimes grown-ups don't listen. Walter chuckled. You're absolutely right about that, young lady. That's exactly why we need advocates, to make sure the truth gets heard, even when it's inconvenient or unexpected. As Walter walked away, Daniel and Isla returned to their planting. When they had finished with the flowers, Daniel pulled out a small wooden sign that he had commissioned from the hospital's woodworking shop. What does it say? Isla asked, though she was beginning to read simple words herself. Daniel held up the sign so she could see the carefully carved letters. Sarah's Garden, a place for truth and courage. Can you read it? He asked. Isla sounded out the words slowly, then smiled with satisfaction. Truth and courage. Like Mommy had, and like I had when I told you about Linda. Exactly like that. They installed the sign together, Isla holding it steady while Daniel secured it in the ground. When they were finished, they sat on the stone bench that faced the newly planted garden. Daddy, Isla said, swinging her legs from the bench. I have an idea. What's your idea? I think the hospital needs new rules. Rules that say children get to tell their side of the story and that grown-ups have to listen. Daniel smiled. During the investigation into Linda's fraud, several disturbing patterns had emerged about how children's reports of unusual or concerning behavior had been dismissed or ignored. The hospital's administration was already working on policy changes, but Isla's suggestion was more direct and practical than anything the adults had proposed. That's an excellent idea, Daniel said. In fact, I think we should write that down and present it to the hospital board. Isla's eyes lit up. Really? Like a real proposal? Like a real proposal. They spent the next hour drafting what Isla called the Children's Truth Rules. The document was simple, written in language that a child could understand but comprehensive, enough to address the serious issues that had been revealed during Linda's case. Rule 1. Every child has the right to be heard, especially when adults are being quiet. Rule 2. When a child says something important about their health or safety, at least 2 different grown-ups have to listen and write it down. Rule 3. Children are allowed to ask questions about their medical care, and they should get honest answers that they can understand. Rule 4. If a child is scared or confused about something happening to them, they can ask for a special advocate to help them talk to the doctors and nurses. Rule 5. No grown-up is allowed to tell a child that their feelings or observations are wrong just because the child is young. As they walked back toward the hospital, Daniel felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death: genuine hope for the future. "Daddy," Isla said, taking his hand as they approached the main entrance, "I have another idea." "What's that?" "I think I should be the hospital's lie detection director. You know, to make sure nobody else tries to trick families like Linda did." Daniel laughed, the first truly joyful sound he had made in months. "I think that's the best idea you've had yet, but you might need to wait a few years before you can officially take the job." "That's okay," Isla said with the patient confidence of childhood. "I'll practice until then." As they entered the hospital together, Daniel realized that his daughter had given him something far more valuable than the truth about Linda's deception. She had given him a reminder that honesty, courage, and love were more powerful than any manipulation or fraud. And in a world that often seemed complicated and frightening, that was a truth worth planting, worth nurturing, and worth protecting. This story shows us that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most important truths. Children see the world with clarity that we adults often lose, and their honesty can save us from our own blind spots. If this story touched you, if it reminded you to listen more carefully to the children in your life, then please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Hit that like button if you believe in the power of truth, subscribe for more stories that celebrate courage and justice, and let me know in the comments. Have you ever learned something important from a child that adults had missed? Sometimes the most profound wisdom comes from the most unexpected sources.